freedom. There is no sweeter word than freedom. There is no nobler goal than freedom. There's no higher aspiration than freedom. Americans know that, and you know it. And all that we do now must be done so our children and grandchildren will know it as well.
With President Joe Biden's surprise trip into Kyiv to stand with a Democratic leader fighting to protect his democracy, and that sweeping speech delivered to underscore some of those themes in Warsaw this week, we are all reminded about just how fragile democracy and freedom really are. Nothing exemplifies this more than the fact that Ukrainians who were going about their lives a year and a day ago are now on the front lines of a war, defending their homeland, their country, and defending their freedom and their democracy, not just for them, but for us too, for other democracies. But despite a week of trying to underscore that point and celebrating a lift-up democracy and its ideals and all that it is, it seems that there are still some people here in this country, in the Republican Party, who want to destroy it right now, today, even as we celebrate Ukraine's valiant efforts. On President's Day, a day honoring the presidents of our great experiment in freedom in these United States, as well as during President Biden's trip to Ukraine, one of the main peddlers of far-right conspiracy theories and the newly anointed best friend and power broker of Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Marjorie Taylor Greene, called unequivocally for the dissolution of our country, tweeting this, quote, "We need a national divorce. We need to separate by red states and blue states and shrink the federal government. From the sick and disgusting woke culture issues shoved down our throats to the Democrats' traitorous America Last policies, we are done." The first intuition is to ignore her, right? To brush off crazy MTG, to ignore the comments that make clear she's a member of the fringy right. But we can't do that anymore, right? Thanks to Kevin McCarthy, she's the most powerful person in his caucus. And the scary thing is she's not alone in her views and what she's advocating. She's a louder voice, a louder movement, a louder sentiment within the GOP. Pete Wehner writes this in The Atlantic, quote, "The Republican Party, forged a century and a half ago in the fight against secession, now finds the move worth contemplating." Joining us now, former Obama Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes and former Maryland Congresswoman Donna Edwards, both are MSNBC contributors. Ben, your thoughts?
Well, I think you framed it right, Nicole, in the sense that we are clearly living in a very consequential time. And nowhere is that clearer than in Ukraine, where you have this fault line between the democratic world and the autocratic world, and as brutal a conflict as we've seen in Europe since World War II taking place. Then you have China challenging the United States much more directly than they ever have before, and a fault line there, and Taiwan. And then here back home, you have this disease has infected the Republican Party, kind of reaching this logical crescendo in Marjorie Taylor Greene's words, which is that essentially our democracy is not worth preserving, our union is not even worth preserving. It's so discordant from the stakes in people's lives in this country and what's happening around the world. And yet, as much as you could dismiss it, it has very real consequences. You talk to people in Ukraine, part of the reason, as your last panel pointed out, that they feel like the next year is decisive, part of it that's unspoken is that nobody knows what's going to happen in our election in 2024. And you have Donald Trump lurking in the wings, and you've got Ron DeSantis kind of moving in the direction of that MAGA brand of American isolationism. And so what's at stake really is the safety and security and future of our democracy, but also the ripple effects that has all over the world. And so we can't dismiss people that are this close to power. And frankly, we have only lived through this period of divided government for like a month. What's going to happen when there are inevitably major crises internationally or domestically in this country? What's going to happen in this new era of divided government with people like her that close to the center of power? I think we could be in for some really unsteady times, not the least of which, of course, is the debt ceiling.
I mean, Donna, the right did such a job on smearing and dismantling legitimate questions raised by Special Counsel Robert Mueller's probe about shared goals between the Russian government and the Trump campaign, which it actually proves out in Volume 1, a shared mission of electing Donald Trump. and making sure Hillary Clinton was not elected. But there's such I mean, some Congressman Swalwell and Congressman Schiff come back to it. But here are the facts. Here's what's happened just since the Republicans have taken over. Actually, this happened before. 10 House Republicans voted against military aid for Ukraine. The usual suspects, but I'll read them out here. Andy Biggs, Dan Bishop, Warren Davidson, Matt Gaetz, Paul Gosar, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Thomas Massey, Ralph Norman, Scott Perry, and Tom Tiffany. You have Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeting about secession, and you have this comment from Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who tweeted this yesterday after I had a chance to talk to her Monday. As they commented yesterday, breaking up America is a Kremlin talking point and aspiration. Putin supports secessionist movements all over the world. He'd like to see the U.S. implode from within, meeting the fate of his beloved USSR. So again, I think we get stuck with who chicken and egg. The point is, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Vladimir Putin, and too often than I think anyone would like to acknowledge, Tucker Carlson, are all on the same page.
Well, they are. They're all singing from the same playbook. And, you know, when I heard President Biden in Kyiv and then, of course, in Warsaw, I heard that he was speaking as much to an international audience as he was to a domestic audience. The clarion call for democracy and freedom, because he realizes and recognizes the challenges that we are facing. And we might describe it as a small outlier faction. But the problem with that description is that that faction grows, and it's echoing a sentiment of we don't even know what percent of the American people. And Marjorie Taylor Greene isn't just an outlier anymore. She is central in the Republican Party, in the Republican House of Representatives. And so I don't think that we can just dismiss these notions as somehow separate from our own fight for freedom and for democracy. And it really is on the line. And I worry that sometimes we think that Russia is one thing and something separate from the fight that we are having here in the United States. But that can't be true when the echoes are the same from members of the Republican Party as we hear from the Kremlin.
And even if a Kremlin takeover of the GOP isn't imminent, there is this risk of political violence that is also written about in this Atlantic piece. Let me read this to you, Pete. This is from Pete Weiner's piece. Civil war, like secession, is not going to happen in the United States, at least not anytime soon. But all of the emotions that are attached to a desire for secession, seething resentment, existential fear, an unforgiving spirit, contempt, and hatred for those who disagree with you are stoked by this kind of rhetoric employed by Marjorie Taylor Greene and those who see the world as she does. Such language will further destroy America's political culture and could easily lead to extensive political violence. Ben, it seems like that's some of what we've entered into with the shooting, the targeted political shootings in New Mexico, the attack on the speaker's husband, and others.
Yeah, I mean, Nicole, it's currently happening. You know, this is not a future scenario. I mean, and what happens is because it's incremental in its escalation, first we get accustomed to threats, then we get accustomed to, you know, small acts of violence, and then we get accustomed to the increasing pace of those acts of violence. Like, this is already ticking upward. And I think I'm going to come back to something you said, though, because these things all do connect, and you have to take them seriously. I want to say this from experience. It was easy, you know, say, after the 2012 election to dismiss Donald Trump as like a Marjorie Taylor Greene. This guy's, he's fringe, and sure, they're nutso things that they say on Fox News, but this is kind of over here, and maybe we laugh at it. Well, a few years later, he was president, you know? And to your Russia point, we constantly had this debate about, is Russia creating all this content that is catching fire on the internet and in the conspiracy theorist corners of the internet and on right-wing media, or are the Russians simply amplifying? I think it doesn't matter. It's a distinction without a difference. The point is, there are people that are against democracy, that want to turn us against one another, that are okay radicalizing people even to commit acts of violence. And that's been a snowball that has been growing over the course of the last decade. And we can't assume that it's going to go away, particularly when there's so much momentum behind it, so much media behind it as well. We have to take it seriously, and we have to, as Donna said, like, look at this as one big challenge. It's not like there's an international challenge over here and then a domestic set of issues here. These are forces that are trying to tear us apart. And unless we can find some high ground and come together and fight back on all these fronts, we should not take for granted our democracy and the stability that it provides in this country and around the world.
I feel like the three of us need to pick up on this, because I think that is the national security crisis of the moment, this intersection of our adversary and the amplifiers in our country. And again, who started it doesn't matter. That's the, you know, middle school question. Its effect is, but it's also this great political opportunity to sort of further and grow the democracy voter. So to be continued with Ben Rhodes and Donna Edwards. Thank you so much.